How's everybody this morning? Good. You know what? One of the most thankless jobs in the church is the person who takes care of our audio visual. And it's been a nightmare for Leanne this morning, but she's got everything up. And I just really am grateful for the way she has stepped up and is learning this system and takes care of us. Thank you. Yeah. So we've been journeying with Jacob now for several months. And as we're going along with him in this journey, we've witnessed him growing in his awareness of God. And last week, we saw that God told him that it was time to go home. I don't mean die, it's time to go back to Canaan. And through a series of events, he was able to get out of the grasp of his father-in-law, Laban. So he's home free now, right? No, he's got a greater obstacle in his way than even Laban was. His greatest challenge, one word, and what is it? Esau. His twin brother, who last we heard from him, said, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill Jacob, back in chapter 27 and verse 41. And so that being the case, in my opinion, Genesis chapter 32 is the pivotal point in the life of Jacob. Now, he's had several pivotal points, but this is the pivotal point. Because by the end of this chapter, he's going to be a different person. So, let's begin reading. Verse 1. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, This is the camp of God. So he named that place Mahanaim. Now, I've even checked the Hebrew pronunciations this week, okay? So I'm trying to get these words today. You might say, that's not how that's said. Trust me, I've listened. This is the way Hebrew people say it's to be said. So I'm going to give it my best. But this appearance of the angels right here sets the tone for this chapter. In his first encounter with God, the stairway to heaven dream, angels were involved in that story, weren't they? They were coming and going on the stairway. And because of them, Jacob had come to realize that that place was a holy place. It was a place where heaven and earth met. And so, as he journeys toward a meeting with his brother, one that we are going to see that he is very anxious about, and for good reason, what more assuring experience could he have than to know that there is an army of angels with him? They're a reminder of God's promise to Jacob that I'm going to be with you and I'm going to take care of you. So verse 3 says, Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, This is what you're to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I've been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I'm sending this message to my lord that I may find favor in your eyes. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him. This messenger is not saying, Esau's got a nice greeting party for you. Okay, you realize that, right? So Jacob has sent this messenger to inform Esau that he's coming, and he's hoping that this is going to bring about a reconciliation. When the messenger returns, though, news isn't so good, is it? 400 men. What's Jacob got? His wives, his sub-wives, his children, maybe some servants. And this is Esau, a.k.a. I'm going to kill Jacob. No doubt a flood of memories just comes washing over Jacob at this point as he's thinking about his scheming, his manipulation, his deceit. He's had 20 years to think about what it would be like when he sees Esau again. And so he, no doubt, is imagining the worst right here. He vividly pictures his angry brother coming at him with 400 men. There's little reason for optimism, right? And so, assuming the worst, Jacob takes some preemptive measures. It says, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. So he's hoping that by doing this, at least someone might survive to carry on the family name. Maybe out of 11 sons, one of them will survive if I divide them up like this. And as we've seen before, Jacob's first inclination is to act upon his instincts. But this time there's something different. We see Jacob growing because he suddenly stops at this point and he cries out to God. It says, then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I'm unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you've shown your servant. Do you hear a different Jacob? I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I've become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid he'll come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. It's a good prayer. In this prayer, we see some humility for a change, don't we? In this prayer, we see honesty. He repents. He fesses up to his shortcomings. And he acknowledges that God has blessed his life. He left home with nothing but a staff. 20 years later, he's returning a wealthy man. And here's where the story gets weird. Well, no, there's another section I need to talk about first. So after praying, he comes up with this plan. The kind of plan that any resourceful person might have come up with in a situation, in a crisis like this. So it says he spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds. He instructed the one in the lead, when my brother Esau meets you and asks, who do you belong to, and where are you going, and who owns all these animals in front of you, then you are to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They're a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he's coming behind us. And he also instructed the second, the third, and all the others who followed the herds, you are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And be sure to say, your servant Jacob is coming behind us. For he thought, I'll pacify him with these gifts I'm sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he'll receive me. Pretty good plan, right? So Jacob's gifts, go to the next slide, please. So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him. but he himself spent the night in the camp. Now, this gift is huge. He sends more than 550 animals in 5 different groups, with a servant leading each one of those groups. What's his plan? To appease his brother. But put yourself in the story. Don't you wonder what Esau was thinking with the first group that he saw? Do you think that meant much to him, the first group that came by? It just made him more aware, perhaps, that Jacob's not very far away. Maybe by the second group, he's beginning to think, maybe my brother's changed. Third time, can't you see with each time that these herds come by, perhaps Esau's heart is softening a little bit? Right. Well, yeah, obviously he's a wealthy man now. But each servant was to inform Esau that this was a gift from Jacob. Someone's actually put pencil to this and figured out that in today's dollars, this gift that Jacob is giving Esau would be worth about $318,000. So it's significant. And Jacob's hope is that these gifts and his repeated message will soften his brother's heart and even provide his brother Esau with a substitute for the inheritance that Jacob had stolen from him. It appears that it works, as we're going to see. But he's still worried. He's worried so much that he is unable to sleep that night. It says in verse 32, that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob's mind is racing. He's going through, you ever had one of those nights? Every possible scenario is running through his mind. Possibilities are running through his head, and none of them are providing him comfort. And here's where the story gets really weird. And here's where things are about to change. How drastically, you ask? Well, let's put it this way. When the sun went down that night, his name was Jacob. Before the sun comes up the next morning, his name's going to be Israel. Now, we don't catch this. When the sun went down that night, he was the deceiver. When the sun comes up the next morning, he's the one who wrestled with God. And that night by the Jabbok is going to make all the difference. It's been said that a crisis doesn't make a person. A crisis just reveals what kind of person you already are. I think oftentimes that's true. But it's not always true. From time to time, God brings certain people to crisis points in their lives that radically change them forever. Case in point, Saul to Paul. Okay? So sometimes God does this. And something like that is about to happen. This crisis will not only reveal what Jacob is, this crisis is going to transform him into something different. Now, for most of us, our deepest experiences with God are preceded by a personal crisis in our lives. Can you relate to that? Jacob's crisis can be summed up in one word: Esau. And he's lived with this for 20 years. Now, with Laban behind him, he doesn't have to think about that anymore, so now he's obsessed with Esau again. And in a few hours, he's going to come face to face with this brother that he deceived and cheated so many years earlier. It's unfinished business. You know what I'm talking about, unfinished business? Most of us have some unfinished business in our lives. Maybe it's a broken relationship that you thought that time would heal. Maybe it was an unkind word that you said that you thought that with time it would be forgotten. Maybe it's a lie that you told that you didn't think would ever catch up with you. You may have counted on that old saying, time heals all wounds. And for the most part, physically, that's true. But when it comes to deep emotional wounds, time doesn't necessarily heal them. As Beverly would tell you, time done well can heal them. But time doesn't necessarily heal emotional wounds. So mark it down. Sooner or later, we must come face to face with our unfinished business. We must face the people we hurt. We must come clean. We must own up to what we did, unless we want to die with a legacy of leaving unfinished business. And Jacob's come to that moment. And so he's camping by the Jabbok. Let me show you, I don't know how well you can see this particular map, but I want you to picture if you went northeast of this map, if you went off the northeast corner several hundred miles, this is where Jacob began his journey, okay? And so he's taken what's known as the King's Highway. This was a major trade route in ancient times. And he's come down here. You see Dan up at the very top. Dan is where you would enter into the land of Canaan. And so he comes through Dan. He comes down, might surprise us, because where's he going to end up? Well, see Beersheba down at the very lower left side? That's close to where he's going to end up. But he comes down the east side of the Jordan River, and he's now to what's known as the mountains of Gilead. Go to that next slide, please. Pretty. You don't think of Israel and the Middle East as having this kind of pretty scenery, do you? But this is the mountains of Gilead, and it's beautiful. And in those mountains is the Jabbok, this river right here. And it's here that this story takes place. Jacob's alone. He sent his family and kids ahead of him. He's all alone. God's finally gotten him exactly where he wants him. It's just Jacob and God. Everyone else is on the other side of the river. Now, when's the last time God spoke to Jacob in an intimate, deep way? "20 years ago, Stairway to Heaven, point of crisis." What's the crisis at that point in his life? He's fleeing from home, right? He's fleeing from Esau. And back then, he was scared to death. And he was alone. 20 years later, fleeing from Esau. But this time, he has no place to run and hide because he's going toward Esau now. And it's in this desperate moment of loneliness that God begins to deal with him. You know, the greatest problem that God has with most of us, and I include myself in this company, the greatest problem he has with most of us is getting us to slow down long enough to listen to him. We're always on the move. We're always talking and seldom stopping to listen. We crank it up from the moment we get out of bed in the morning until we go to bed at night. It's get in gear or get out of the way. We fear slowing down, particularly those of us who are still in the workplace. We fear slowing down because we're afraid of what's coming up behind us. And when God speaks to us, because of that, so often what we hear is like listening to a faint radio signal, where you might catch a word here and there, but there's just a lot of static. So what does God do? You're not going to like my answer. And some of you already know this because you've experienced it. Sometimes what God will do is if we don't slow down on our own, He'll slow us down. It may be a pink slip that we weren't expecting. It may be one of those calls you get in the middle of the night. It might be a serious illness. It might be a financial disaster. Or any one of 1,000 other things, crises that can break into our routines. And they force us to stop what we're doing and listen to God. So what happens next has stretched our imaginations for 3,000 years. Verse 24 says, "So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak." I got to admit, this just is weird. I mean, even the way it's written is weird. Most of us, we know the story already, but think about if you're hearing this for the first time, and you're told Jacob was alone, and then without any warning, you're just told, and this man wrestled with him all night long. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Here he is, all alone with his thoughts. He's not able to sleep. He's probably looking up at the stars, wondering what tomorrow is going to bring, when suddenly this man appears, ninja-like, and just starts wrestling him. There's no, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, you think you can take me down?" No, he just starts wrestling him. Now, who is this man? Is it one of Esau's army? Is it an assassin that he sent by night to take Jacob out? Or is it, as some people, there's a lot of people when they read the Old Testament, they somehow want to inject the physical Jesus into the story. And so some people think this is a pre-incarnate Jesus wrestling with Jacob. Some have done the same thing with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember when the king looks into the fiery furnace and says, "There's one like the Son of God"? Some have said, well, that was Jesus in there with them. I don't know. I'm not nearly theologian enough to figure all that out. But I will tell you this. It helps to know that the common Hebrew word for man, and you may know this. Anyone know what the common Hebrew word for man is? Adam. Adam, actually. When Adam was created, he's man. That's what he is. So that's the common Hebrew word for man, but the word that's here in the text is the word ish. And ish in Hebrew can be translated as man, but ish also oftentimes just simply means something more vague than that. It means something like an individual. Okay? And I think that's important. And I don't think Moses is saying here that Jacob wrestled a biological man, as much as Jacob is saying, or as much as Moses is saying that Jacob wrestled with someone. Now later on, Jacob's going to identify this someone as Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew word that's found all through Genesis chapter 1 for God. It simply means the Creator God. And so Jacob identifies the one he wrestled with as God. But maybe he's even slightly mistaken. Because later on in the Bible, Hosea the prophet is going to identify who this was. In Hosea chapter 12 and verse 3, he's telling the story of Jacob, and he says this: "In the womb he grasped his brother's heel. As a man he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel and overcame him. He wept and begged for his favor." So I think I'm going to go with Hosea and say that this is an angel that Jacob is wrestling with, which still leaves a lot of unanswered questions, doesn't it? Verse 25 says, "When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket," and then that Hebrew word means he tapped. He just barely touched it. He touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So what's the significance of all this wrestling match? I mean, we all would agree that this is a significant moment, right? Jacob is battling for his life. He's grabbing and he's struggling and he's angling for any advantage that he can get. All night just tired. Seconds. Yeah, it doesn't take very long. This is going on all night long. Hours pass. Neither one can get an advantage on the other. And Jacob's exhausted, but he can't show any signs of weakness. And sunrise isn't far away. The first rays of the sun are beginning to rise above those mountains of Gilead. And suddenly, this mysterious one reaches out and taps his hip. And the bone Jacob feels go out of socket. Which leaves me with a question. Why couldn't the angel have beaten Jacob hours before this? So all he had to do is tap his hip. But he wrestled with Jacob all night long. And I think that it was to demonstrate to Jacob that no matter how much strength you think you have, you cannot overcome God. And I picture it the way that I used to wrestle with my boys. Any of you dads who had sons and maybe even daughters, when they're little, I'm talking about when they're little, okay? I wouldn't want to do this with my boys today. But when you're little and you're wrestling with your kids, you could pin them like that, couldn't you? I mean, it could be over before it started. But what do you do as a dad? You play along. You might even let them think that they're beating you sometime. You know what I mean? You play along. And so why did the angel touch Jacob's hip? Well, first of all, he says it's because sunlight was coming. The angel had to leave when it was daylight. Don't ask me why. He wasn't Dracula. The hip bone's the hip is one of the strongest muscles in our body. And in effect, what he did is he crippled Jacob. It was an acted out object lesson, I believe, with a moral that no one can miss. When you wrestle with God, you will always lose. But here's the cool part. Sometimes in wrestling with God and losing, you win. Any of you who have been through a faith struggle, are you with me here? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. Yeah, that's a lot of the purpose for this, which is the same as if we were wrestling with God over something. So, even with his hip out of joint, or as we might say today, even though he's got a hitch in his get along, Jacob is holding on for dear life. He's at a point where he is finally willing to submit to God's authority. And in a brief conversation that follows, we discover 4 things about Jacob. The first thing we discover is a new determination. It says, "Then the man said, 'Let me go, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob replied, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.'" Up to this point in his life, Jacob has used all of his strengths and all of his abilities to achieve his own ends. And for the first time, it appears he's come to the end of that. And all his huffing and puffing and positioning has brought him to realize how helpless he is when compared with the strength of God. He's learned the lesson of Zechariah, chapter 4 and verse 6, that says, "Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty." And so he's determined that this being, this angel, blesses him, brings him the peace, brings him what it is that he needs for this situation. And if he can't win the fight, he's not going to give up until he gets that blessing. When our greatest energies are surrendered to God, our lives are going to go in a different direction. Second is a new confession. We may not get this because, again, we don't put significance with the meaning of names like they used to. But it says, the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Let's do this a little bit differently. "What is your name?" "Deceiver." And this is a turning point. This is a crucial moment. Did the angel need to ask Jacob his name? Do you think he probably already knew that? I think the question is, does Jacob really know who he is? Deceiver. He's 100 years old, perhaps, at this point. He's lived a long time living up to that name. And by asking Jacob his name, the angel's really asking, are you ready to admit to who you really are? I believe that's what's happening here. And that's hard to do, isn't it? To admit to who we really are. Most of us will do anything to avoid the hard truth about who we are. Yes, the truth will set you free, but sometimes to get you to the freedom, the truth will be painful. Third, he's given a new name. Then the man said, your name will no longer be deceiver, Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Who won the match that night? God. Who lost? Jacob. But who really won? In the long run, Jacob won too. And this is a paradox of life. That when we wrestle with God, we always lose. But in losing, we can win. Man, I could go on about that. Alexander Campbell, one of the leaders of the American Restoration Movement, of which we are a part. He had a long life of trying to figure out what he believed about God and what he believed about faith and all of those things. And so do you know what the biography of his life was called? Wrestling with God. And he came out the winner. Fourth is a new blessing. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. No longer will Jacob be known as deceiver. Now he's going to be known as the one who wrestled with God. Now I know in some of our minds we think, no, it's wrong to wrestle with God. I hope none of you feel that way. I hope none of you feel guilty when you wrestle with God over things, when you maybe even go through a period of doubting and things like that, because if you'll hang with it, if you'll wrestle with God through it, you'll come out the winner. And when this long night was over, Jacob knew something that he hadn't really known before. He knew that God knew him better than he knew himself. And yet God was still going to be faithful to his promises to him. God's saying, you don't have to cheat and manipulate anymore. From here on out, we're walking together, you and I. And those days of being the cheater, they're gone forever. So it concludes like this. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it's because I saw God face to face and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Jacob never forgot what happened at Jabbok. This was a life-changing event. His descendants never forgot it. You do realize Moses, typically he's given credit for writing Genesis. Moses wouldn't have written this for 400 years after this event. 400 years. That's longer than we have any history in the United States. And yet the events continued to be a reminder, even affecting the way the people ate. Now Jacob's going to live many more years. But that hitch in his get-along is going to be a perpetual reminder of what God had done that night. And I would suggest to you that it is better to limp through life trusting God completely than strutting through life under our own arrogance. I've learned this lesson of Jacob in much the same way that he has, through wrestling with God, through some hard and bitter experiences. And I know many of you share that same story. But my observation is that oftentimes the people that God uses most are ones who limp to the finish line. Would you agree? I've left y'all 1 minute. You have 1 minute to speak your piece. Hey, let's pray. Father, let us not miss the power in these stories.